Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us to the first webinar of 2024 for the Measuring Adult Mortality Community of Practice, which is also today a UN Statistical Commission side event. And the topic is innovations and difficulties in measuring adult mortality in countries in crisis. We have two presentations today, and please note that we are recording the webinar, and if you can kindly stay muted during the presentation so that we don't have any background noise, that would be great. To begin with, today I would like to invite Rachel Bevan, who is the Director of the Statistical Division of ESCAP, to give some opening remarks. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, and it's my pleasure to be able to join you today. So let me also say, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's one of those sessions where we've got people joining, I think, from throughout the globe. So that's great to be able to welcome everyone. And it's also great for me. This is my first side event for this year for the Statistical Commission. So really looking forward to many more. But it is really great to be able to welcome you to this session, as we say, looking at innovations and difficulties in measuring adult mortality in countries in crisis. And today we're going to really delve into this critical but often overlooked aspect of crisis, and that's the measurement of adult mortality. So whether it's an Ebola outbreak, the ongoing battle against COVID, conflicts, wars, environmental shocks, earthquakes, tsunamis, all of those seem to share this common thread, and that's that they often have a disproportionate effect and impact on young adults. And young adults who might usually actually have lower mortality rates in stable times often find themselves really at the centre of these crises, and their vulnerabilities then are really challenged in these situations. And I think we also know as well that actually, measuring adult mortality is difficult at all times, but absolutely so much more so when we're looking in crisis situations, and particularly as we're grappling with aftermath of crisis as well. It becomes really evident then that we need this information. We need to actually be able to understand the impact of what's happening, but particularly as well to be able to understand the impact on different vulnerable groups. So we really need that comprehensive data on adult mortality to help to inform then short and long-term strategies for actually rebuilding, but also for recovery. So it really helps as well in terms of directing resources effectively. And that is so important at the moment as well. I think, obviously all countries, all individuals are affected by kind of, budget constraints. So it's on our, it's really paramount then that we all look at what we can do to make sure we make the best possible use of what resources there are that are available. So measuring adult mortality really helps us then to gain an insight, not just about what's been happening in terms of an immediate toll of a crisis, but also to help us really lay that groundwork for understanding then how we can rebuild more resilient societies that can actually make sure then that they can be better prepared to withstand future challenges. So we are going to hear from people who know an awful lot more about the subject than I do. That's why I'm looking forward to hearing from them. So I'm not going to say much more, but just to say that it's great to have the speakers that we do today to really get this range of different perspectives as well. And given that we know this is a challenging area, it means that actually it's so much more important than ever to really learn what we can from what is going on. So I just wanted to say, before I hand over back to the facilitator, let's all remember as well, we're talking about numbers here, but what we're actually talking about is individuals, isn't it? And each number represents an individual, a lost life. And improving the measurement of adult mortality, then it's not just a statistical exercise. It really is that crucial step in helping towards future saving lives, but also building that more resilient and more compassionate world. So with that, I'm going to hand back, and then I'm going to carry on absolutely listening to all our great speakers. Thank you so much, Ashura.
Thank you very much, Thank you for your remarks. And we actually have a second introduction to today's webinar by Ramesh Silva, who is a technical specialist from the Population Fund and has also worked on measuring adult mortality in countries where there's conflict. Thank you, Ramesh, for joining us.
Well, thanks so much, Ashira, and it's great to be with everybody for this really important webinar. And it's fantastic to follow Rachel's comments. Just to emphasize, I think, ultimately this is really, a human rights and ethical question about who counts, and really ensuring that even when all deaths, particularly in crisis situations, are not able to be officially recorded as part of the civil registration system, that they're at least able to be estimated, so that the occurrence and the ramifications of that loss of life can be fully accounted for. So I think that's, just to underline that. I wanted to run through just a couple of sort of big challenges in the field, which I think are worth, keeping in the back of our minds as we hear from Casey and Bruno in a moment. And so first off, one thing to note is that crises are becoming more frequent, partly due to the effects of climate change, but also due to increased conflict and political fragility. Just within, the last 8 or 9 years, what we've seen is between 2015 and 2023, the annual UN Global Humanitarian Appeal has more than doubled in size. It's gone from about $20 billion in 2015 to over $55 billion in 2023. In addition to that, crises are becoming more protracted. And as part of that protracted experience, we're seeing these kinds of crises being highlighted by increased forced displacement. Recent crises in Syria, Ukraine, and the occupied Palestinian territories bring this to bear. And that mobility, forced displacement, makes mortality measurement even more challenging. As demographers and statisticians, we know that when we want to do any kind of population and demographic measurement, one of the key features that we really need is some form of population stability, people sort of staying in one place to facilitate, systematic and very well-controlled measurement and sampling and data collection. The other thing here to note is that most countries experiencing crises and crisis-related mortality these days are challenged by a great paucity of traditional data sources. For example, the last census in the Democratic Republic of Congo was 1984, in Lebanon, 1935. In many of these countries, we see civil registration and vital statistics systems are either weak or currently works in progress, and or they're severely damaged and disrupted due to the conflict itself, as we see in current day Syria and Palestine, even though these are places where in recent years the death registration system has been strong and very good. Further notable challenges here in terms of decomposing between the direct and indirect mortality effects of conflict, and direct deaths in the forms of killings and forced disappearances, and indirect deaths in the form of mortality due to the breakdown of the health, transportation, or food security systems. And so, and then one other piece to note, which we at UNFPA have been doing a lot of work over the last few years on, is that the official statistical system in many humanitarian crises tends to operate in silo to the humanitarian data ecosystem. And I think this is a huge missed opportunity. And what we need to see in general, but in particular when it comes to conflict-related mortality measurement, is more alignment and more integration of both traditional official statistical data sources and more non-traditional data streams and efforts by humanitarian data actors. We'll hear from Casey and Bruno in a moment, but one thing to recognize is that over the last 10 or so years, there's been a lot of excitement about the potential for big data, for new survey methods. And I think what's most promising, perhaps, is these to be developed and engineered not just as standalones, but ones with efforts which integrate different data sources and different approaches. I think in particular, we'll hear from Casey about tapping into social networks as a means to build out the observation and sampling of conflict-related deaths during crisis. And I think when our go-to methods of full enumeration or probabilistic-based random sampling become infeasible due to issues of access and instability, these kinds of alternatives in terms of tapping new technology, but also unpacking the information networks and the social networks of the affected population are going to be critical. So, and let me close by just really highlighting a couple of things which I think would be really helpful to think about, and I hope people raise in the Q&A, and we can think together about how to move this forward. What we're seeing now internationally is new opportunities being rolled out. The UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, has now launched a new set of results monitoring surveys and forced displacement surveys. And so it would be super interesting to start thinking about how some of the new innovative methods, which Casey and Bruno will walk us through, might be able to be integrated into these standardized survey programs, which are being increasingly customized in different crisis-related settings. So let me stop there and pass back to Ashira so we can hear the frontline acts of the day. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Ramesh, and thank you for joining us early in the morning. Today, so we're going to have two presentations, as you already know, and we're going to start off with Casey Breen, our first speaker, who's a Senior Postdoctoral Fellow in Computational Sciences at the University of Oxford. And Casey has worked on developing and applying computational and demographic methods to examine questions in population health, including using network-based methods to sample hard-to-reach populations and estimating death rates in humanitarian emergencies. Thank you for joining us, Casey.
Great. Thanks very much for having me. Thanks for that introduction, and thanks very much to Rachel and Ramesh for giving kind of a broader introduction to this talk. I thought that leads very nicely into what I'm going to be presenting on today, which is estimating death rates in complex humanitarian emergencies. So this is joint work with Professor Dennis Ian at the University of California, Berkeley, Saeed Rahman, Christina Kay, and Yuri Smits at the NGO REACH Initiative, and Steve Ahuka at the University of Kinshasa in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So a quick roadmap for what I'm going to be talking about today. So first, I'm going to give a high-level overview of some, not all, of the common approaches for mortality estimation in humanitarian emergencies. Then I'm going to give a brief introduction to the network survival method. And then I'm going to talk briefly about a case study that's ongoing in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So the motivation for this study is that death rates are critical in conflict settings and in humanitarian emergencies for assessing the severity of an emergency and effectively allocating aid. They're also important for other reasons, such as memorializing the toll of victims due to humanitarian emergencies, and perhaps even more fundamentally, often crude death rates are used to define what is and what is not considered an emergency by many various international NGOs and government organizations. So the question here that we're really trying to get at is, how do you best estimate death rates in humanitarian emergencies? Because in these settings, conventional methods generally fall apart or don't work. So often the gold standard, some vital registration system. In many countries undergoing humanitarian emergencies, of course, there isn't even a vital registration system to begin with. But even if there is, if there's a civil war, an earthquake, etc., oftentimes this infrastructure will fall apart. Retrospective household mortality surveys are another kind of popular conventional method, but in, for instance, a civil war, it's very challenging to send out enumerators to places that are so insecure, and that can really impede researchers' efforts at getting a representative probability sample. So as I mentioned, retrospective household surveys can be used in these contexts. However, they have two key limitations. So the first is, generally a retrospective household survey requires a very large sample size to obtain a reasonably accurate estimate of mortality. And often these retrospective household surveys are asking people to report on deaths in the past year or the past 2 years, and they're not as effective for asking respondents to report on deaths that happened in the last week or the last 2 weeks, because you would just need to ask so many people to get an accurate answer. Second, really, when you're doing a retrospective household survey, you want it to be a probability-based survey. Unfortunately, in many areas undergoing, humanitarian emergency, this is infeasible due to logistical or security concerns. A second method for estimating death rates in these settings is a demographic surveillance system. So a demographic surveillance system will work by selecting, for instance, sub-neighborhoods probabilistically and having an enumerator go around at a regularly scheduled time every week, every month, and making sure to capture all the births and all the deaths that are happening in this setting. There's lots of different ways of setting up these demographic surveillance systems, but one of the key limitations of these in a humanitarian emergency is that they also can be very hard to keep ongoing when there's, for instance, a civil war. So finally, we have a relatively new method, key informant reporting. So key informant reporting involves asking someone who is very knowledgeable in the community to report on household deaths in a range of different households. So for instance, someone in a town might be called and asked to report on 20 or 30 of their close neighboring households. And this information is combined together to estimate a mortality rate. And so this works in some settings when we feel that these key informants really are highly informed about mortality in their broader community, but this method needs more validation. So another related method that I'm going to briefly motivate is the sibling method. So the sibling method has been applied a little bit in humanitarian contexts, but it's been much more widely applied just to measure crude death rates at the national level. So the sibling method asks respondents to report on the name, sex, age, and death dates, if applicable, for each one of their siblings. So here we're collecting age information, gender information, and also if one of the siblings died, the date of death. And so all of this information can be combined together to estimate an adult death rate. And so there's lots of methodological work on the sibling method. Generally, the reports are considered more accurate for more recent deaths. So the further back you go, generally 7 years is considered kind of the window in which people can often accurately report. Beyond 7 years, there's some evidence that this really starts to fall apart. So the sibling method, is very effective. It's been included in lots of DHS surveys. However, it's not as useful for estimating real-time death rates. And so in 2007, the Working Group for Mortality Estimation in Emergencies put out this very nice paper that I think is still very relevant today, nearly 15 years later, where they outlined, that there's a very strong demand for these new mortality estimation methods, and we need some innovation in this space. And so that what brings us to the main focus of the talk today, which is on the network survival method. So just to motivate the network survival method from first principles, what we're interested in doing is calculating a death rate. So this death rate MA, and it can be for some subgroup alpha if we want to calculate an age-specific death rate, for instance. And so to calculate this death rate, there's kind of two key pieces of information we'll need to know. We'll need to know in the numerator of this equation some count or number of deaths, and the denominator will need some measure of exposure. So in many humanitarian emergencies, crew death rates are expressed as deaths per 10,000 person days. So for the rest of this presentation, I'll be expressing crew death rates as the number of deaths per 10,000 person days. So the denominator here is going to be person days. So the key idea behind the network survival method is that each person has embedded in their social network lots of valuable information about mortality in their community, and that this information can be collected and aggregated together to estimate a crew death rate. So in this figure here, each circle represents a person, and each line represents a connection between that person and another person. So here we're focusing on this red dot. So consider this to be the respondent, and we're interested in two pieces of information. So the first piece of information is how many people they know who have died. So this person has one connection to someone who has died, and how many people they know in total. This person has 10 people that they know in total. So we combine together the number of reports someone has about deaths in their social network with the total number of people they have in their social network to estimate a death rate. And so, of course, a question that comes up is, well, which social network should we ask people to report on? And so I'll talk a little bit more about how we pick the right social networks for this study and the general trade-offs. So just to give you a little bit of insight into how we're calculating this death rate. So the numerator is going to be the total number of people in respondents' personal network who have died in a given time window. And generally, you can pick different time windows for this method. In this study, we picked a rolling time window, but past network survival studies have picked, for instance, deaths in the last 1 year. And then in the denominator, we can have the total number of people in respondents' personal network. So here, we're really just summing up the total number of deaths that all the respondents reported and dividing by the total number of people that all respondents reported knowing. So to investigate how this method performed in practice, we set up a case study in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So on the left-hand panel, we have a map of Africa. On the right-hand panel, we have an inset where we're pulling out the specific province, Tanganyika province, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo that we focused on. We focused on 3 health zones within this province: Nyamba, Kalemi, and Nyanza. And so how we set up this study to imitate how this method might actually be applied in a humanitarian emergency is that we didn't go out and set up a probability-based network survey. Instead, we set up a non-probability-based network survey where we intercepted respondents in Kalemi town, which is right here on the border of Nyamba and Kalemi. And so Kalemi town is the major transport hub So people from Nyamba, Kalami, and Nyanzu often come in to Kalami town to trade goods, get medical services, meet with family, for work contracts, and even for recreation. So Kalami town is this major central hub, and we were intercepting respondents in Kalami town who are coming from various different parts of Nyanzu, Nyamba, and Kalami. And so this is trying to imitate a real crisis setting where we couldn't go into Nyamba, Nyanzu, or Kalami due to insecurity restrictions. However, we could potentially sample people when they were leaving these areas at a major checkpoint or a major city like Kalami town. So a key design question for this study was, how do we pick the right network tie? So if we pick too big a network tie, so think everyone you've ever talked to in your life, then respondents aren't going to be able to accurately report on either how many of those people have died or how many people on that network they know. And both of those things are really important for getting an accurate estimate. If respondents report on too small a network, that's totally fine, except we'll need a much bigger sample size to learn the same amount of information. So for instance, if people only have 2 or 3 siblings, if we only ask people to report on 2 or 3 siblings, we're going to have to do lots more interviews to learn about mortality as if we asked someone about a larger network that had, for instance, 30 people in it. So to try and pick the right social networks for this setting, and the right social network is going to vary based on the specific setting of each study, we went out and did some formative research. So in this formative research, we conducted a series of qualitative focus groups and individual interviews where we asked respondents about how they learned about deaths in their community, how they processed and grieved deaths, and what type of deaths they could accurately report on in the context of a survey, and what, for instance, the right reference date and right reference period might be. So in these settings, it's often helpful to include a reference event. For instance, here we use New Year's, so January 1st, that can help people place a death as happening before or after that event. For our focus groups, as I mentioned, we conducted 8 different focus groups, and we did these both in the more urban Kalami city and also in more rural villages, and we split this up by age and by gender to maximize respondent participation. So the results of this formative network analysis was that we found that kin and neighbor networks, respondents felt very comfortable that they could report accurately on these networks, and that they could also accurately report on the number of neighbors and the number of kin they had. So here we asked respondents to report on their 5 closest households by walking distance. And then for kin, we asked respondents to report on the total number of grandchildren, children, siblings, cousins, aunts, uncles, grandparents, and parents that they had, and the total number of those people who had died since our reference date of January 1st, 2023. So we collected data in partnership with Reach Initiatives, which is a really great NGO that I think is doing lots of really interesting work in this humanitarian space and in this methodological space. We interviewed the respondents at major transit hubs in Kalami town. We had 8 different enumerators for this study and 2 research managers, and they would do daily check-ins and weekly data reviews. And we did continuous data collection for 4 months, running from March 1st until July 1st of 2023. And while I mentioned this is a non-probability sample, to adjust at some of the potential selection, we set up a quota sample based on geographic region. So we set a target number of people we wanted interviewed from each arrondissement, that's the unit beneath a health zone, based on how many people live there and the gender composition of people living there. So this is still a non-probability sample that doesn't account for lots of different types of selection into our sample, but this is better than not doing anything at all. So for data collection, the interviews were conducted at transit hubs such as markets, ports, taxi stations, health clinics, etc. We tried to select as broad a possible set of selection, as broad a possible selection of different sites to maximize the representativeness of people we are capturing in our sample. We carried out informed consent on a paper form, and then there was a survey that was administered in person by the enumerator on a smartphone. We conducted a total of 2,650 interviews over these 4 months, and all respondents, regardless of when they reported on all deaths in their networks since January 1st, 2023. So just to briefly give you some idea into the results. So first we looked at the network size. So how many kin do people have in their network and how many neighbors do people have in their neighbor network? And on average, we found this is a pretty normally distributed with a slightly longer right tail. The average kin network had about 27 people in it. So people on average reported on 27 kin members. And the neighbor network had on average 29 people in it. So people reported on an average of 29 people for their neighbor network. The number of deaths reported per interview, the most common was that someone knew 0 deaths in their kin network and in their neighbor network. And the average number of deaths reported per interview was about 0.2. So this low number of deaths reported per interview means that we're going to get more high quality data on each death because people aren't going to be as fatigued having to report a long questionnaire on each death. So finally, I'm going to show some preliminary estimates from this study. So first, we calculated 2 different sets of estimates. We calculated unweighted estimates, where we didn't do any different type of weighting adjustment. And then we calculated weights using population composition data from the World Population Group, WorldPop. And here we found that our weighted and our unweighted results aligned pretty closely. So second, we looked at our estimates broken out by the type of network. So we looked at kin networks and we looked at neighbor networks and calculated estimates separately. So here on the y-axis, we have the crude death rate expressed as deaths per 10,000 person days. Generally, a daily crude death rate of 1 is considered a humanitarian emergency. So our estimates suggest that our estimates here were well below a humanitarian emergency and were about comparable with the national level DRC estimates of crude mortality rates. So in addition to our kin and our neighbor estimates, we also calculated a blended estimate where we combined together in a principled way our estimates from the kin and the neighbor network. And I'm happy to talk about how we produce these blended estimates. So next, we looked at whether there is any variation by the zone descent or the health zone. And we find that our estimates are slightly higher for Calamide than they are for Nyamba, but still within, quite comparable, about 0.3 compared to 0.37. Finally, we looked at change over time with our blended estimate. So again, on the y-axis, we're going to have crude death rate. On the x-axis, we're going to have the month of death. And we found that over time, our estimates seemed pretty constant. So we didn't see any large jump or major trends in the death rate over our observation window of January 1st to June 30th of 2023. We also calculated this change over time separately for each different network type and each different zone descent or health zone. There's a little bit of noise here, but broadly, you can see a pretty constant trend over the study period with a good bit of uncertainty around it. So finally, as an internal consistency check, what we did is we looked at the household reports. So we compared the death rates that we would estimate from a network-based method to the death rates we would estimate if someone was only reporting on their own households. And we found that the death rate that we would estimate if someone was only reporting on their own household here was about 10 to 15% higher than estimating based on social networks, but there's a lot of uncertainty here, so we can't say anything definitive. So in terms of next steps, so we're now looking to compare these estimates to a probability-based retrospective household survey. And so we're going to use this as a reference estimate. So far, we've done a little bit of work, and we've been finding that the retrospective household estimate is producing higher estimates of the crude death rate than the network estimate. So we have pre-registered our network survival estimates. So if anyone is interested in our exact methodology for carrying out the study or for estimating mortality based on the data we collected, they're welcome to go and read this pre-registered report. And now we're really interested in decomposing potential sources of error. So we know that our estimates from the household retrospective probability-based household survey that we conducted are a little bit higher than the estimates from our network survival estimates. And so we want to be able to go out and figure out what's driving this difference and whether there's perhaps some bias with the retrospective household survey, for instance, people over-reporting deaths in their household in hopes of receiving aid or some other type of distribution, or whether there's some bias in the network survival estimates. So the specific comparison design we have set up is we have done this network probability survey, which I showed the estimates from today. We're now working on comparing in a systematic way to this probabilistic household survey, where we're conducting studies both of the network death rate between the two different surveys and of a conventional household survey. So this will allow us to unpack error from both the non-probability component of our study and error from the network survival component of our study. So in conclusion, the network method does show that we can detect large changes in humanitarian settings and that it may be helpful for monitoring humanitarian emergencies and mortalities in these settings. However, we need more systematic evaluations of this method. So this is a very challenging question, and there's not one perfect answer to it. So I think we need more evaluations of this method in a wider range of settings, and also to keep in mind that this method is highly contextual and it requires localized knowledge of social networks, diffusion of information about deaths, etc. Thanks very much, and looking forward to your questions during the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Casey. I'm afraid we're going to move quickly straight on to Bruno's presentation. Bruno Lacrande is a lecturer and researcher at the Institut Supérieur des Sciences de la Population at the University of Joseph Key Zerbo in Burkina Faso. And his research includes implementing innovative strategies of data collection in emergency settings, including mobile phone surveys, as well as measuring and estimating mortality from deficient data in sub-Saharan Africa. Thank you for joining us, Bruno.
Okay, it's okay. Can you see my screen?
Not yet.
Ashira? Not yet? Okay, let me try again. Is it okay?
No.
All right.
Do you want me to share it?
Oh, give me 1 second.
Okay.
Give me 1 second. Is it okay?
No.
Okay, if you can share it, I don't know why it doesn't work. Okay.
It worked before.
Yeah.
Okay. You can see it, Bruno?
No, I cannot see the screen. I don't see the screen.
We can see it, Shira.
You can?
Yeah, I can see it. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah. So Bruno, if it's open on your side and just say next slide, we can see it, just you can't. So if you're able to look at
I
your
don't know
version.
what is going on. Okay. Okay. Okay, so thank you so much. It's a great pleasure for me to share the experience of Burkina Faso in terms of data collection to measure adult mortality. So I will focus on difficulties to measure adult mortality in a situation of conflict, and also what can we have as a innovative method to measure adult mortality. So next slide. So I will start by giving an overview of death registration in Burkina Faso according to the last census conducted in 2019. So overall, we have around 17% of deaths that are registered in civil registration in the country. And as expected, in the capital city Ouagadougou and the other town, the level of death registration is higher compared to rural areas. And what is also important to mention is that adult deaths are likely to be reported compared to death in children. So these results are found in most of Sub-Saharan Africa. And last, men deaths are more likely to be reported compared to women deaths. So I'm moving to the next slide. And to understand more on death registration, so I'm presenting here two studies conducted in the Ouagadougou Health and Demographic Surveillance System in the capital city, and the other one in the Nuna Health and Demographic Surveillance System in rural areas. And the two studies show that in Ouagadougou, around 43% of head of household, only 43% know that death should be reported in civil registration, and this figure dropped to 7% in the rural areas. So we have a long way to go in order to achieve a high level of death registration in Burkina Faso. So in this situation, as Casey was saying, most of estimates related to adult are derived from face-to-face survey, large-scale face-to-face survey. For instance, we conduct around 5 DHS in Burkina Faso, and we also conduct censuses. The last one was in 2019, and the country has also around 4 HDSS. So all of these platforms can be used to estimate adult mortality, but with some limits. For example, one key problem is the underreporting of death. And in situation of crisis, what is most important is that the regularity of this survey. So these surveys tend to be timeless in order to monitor adult mortality. So it's difficult to know what is going on in situation of crisis. And the limitation of this survey in situation of conflict. Before moving to limitation, here I'm showing the number of internally displaced persons by region in Burkina Faso. So the conflict in the country starts in 2015, and most of part of the country face terrorist attacks, so that individuals are forced to migrate. So the country is spread over the country, but some region, for example, the Sahel and the eastern part of the country is more affected by the country. And in this situation, one can agree that it's difficult to conduct face-to-face survey. First, as the speaker was saying in the introduction, we have the issue of sampling because people are moving a lot. So we have some sampling issues. Second, it's difficult to access some areas. This leads to coverage issues in the survey, and also the suspicious situation created by the conflict can lead to some data quality issues. And I would take just the case of the DHS conducted in 2015 to highlight some of the issues. For example, this table shows the number of enumeration areas sampled in the DHS and the number that was surveyed during the fieldwork. So we have, overall, we have around 85% of coverage, but this differ in terms of by region. If you take the case of the eastern region, out of 47 enumeration areas, the fieldworker was succeed to conduct the survey in 27 enumeration areas. This leads to a coverage of around 57%. And in the Sahel region, the coverage is even lower. So that it's difficult to interpret a level of mortality of health indicators derived from these two regions. And in addition, the particularity is the fact that these two regions tend to show health indicators that are not good compared to the situation of the country. So it's where we have a lot of problems that it's difficult to have information on mortality or health indicators. So this situation even can impact the estimation at the national level. And also, the conflict also can lead to some conflicting results from the different data sources. Here, it's difficult to interpret, but I'm just showing the level of mortality rate in men and women according to the census and to the DHS. So the estimate derived from the DHS cover the period of the 7 years preceding the survey. So I just take the middle, so 2019.5, because the DHS was conducted in 2021. So you can see that death rate in the DHS is lower compared to death rate in the census. So this can mean an issue in the DHS. This can also mean an issue in the census. But what is important to mention is that during the census, the conflict was not at the same level than during the 2021 DHS. So the situation worsened during the 2021 DHS. So it's difficult to draw a conclusion. Now, in addition to this survey, we have some platform of mortality surveillance in Burkina Faso that I would like to highlight. And so it's maybe we can imagine how to integrate these sources in order to have a level, to have a better estimate of adult mortality. So we have a surveillance of COVID-19 deaths that is implemented by the Ministry of Health. We have also some data on social security that can be used to estimate old age mortality among civil servants. And what I see is that this data can also use to maybe estimate violent death from the conflict, particularly in soldiers, because most of them are registered in social security data. Another source of data is violent death from the National Traffic Safety Administration. And last, we have a rapid mortality mobile phone survey during COVID-19 that was implemented. I will focus on these last data sources because the coverage is high, and I can see it as a net innovative strategy to collect mortality data in conflict of crisis in general. So the objective of the survey, the Rapid Mortality Mobile Phone Survey, is to use mobile phone survey to estimate excess mortality during the COVID-19. And as specific objective, the idea is to develop and validate instrument used in the survey to generate mortality estimate by age and sex, and to conduct some nested validation study in order to validate by the survey. And the project is implemented in 5 countries: Demographic Republic of Congo, Bangladesh, Malawi, and Mozambique. So this project is conceptualized to estimate excess mortality during COVID-19, but one can recognize that the strategy used can be useful to estimate mortality in any situation of crisis, because a phone survey tends to overcome some of the limitations that we highlight in face-to-face survey. Even we can also know that there are some issues with a phone survey, but some limitation of face-to-face survey can be resolved thanks to mobile phone survey. So I'm presenting this survey with this idea that it can be implemented in situation of crisis. So in Burkina Faso, we used 2 sampling strategies to conduct the survey. The first one was to use phone numbers that was collected during a previous survey, the Living Standard Survey that was conducted in 2018 and 2019. So we will contact head of household, and we try to speak to a woman of reproductive age. And we also use random digit dialing as a strategy to collect the data. And so a company called VMO helped us to screen functional phone numbers in order to conduct the survey. And there are quota were set by trimester in order to have a kind of representation of place of residence, sex, and age. And questions related to mortality include household death, parental survival, sibling history to estimate adult mortality, and truncated birth history to estimate under 5 mortality. And in terms of response rate, we have a response rate of 70% in the random digit dialing arm and around 75% in the Living Standard Survey arm. So overall, the response rate was high during this survey. And let's now move to estimate of adult mortality. Here, so I'm presenting by sex the level of adult mortality derived from the RAMS survey and compared to level in World Population Prospect 2022 and also in the last DHS. So what we can see is that estimates derived from the RAMS are lower compared to other sources of data. And right now we are working on that to understand what is happening. And so the validation study that we conduct in the Ouagadougou HGSS will help us to better understand the source of error in the RAMS survey if we trust estimate from the World Population Prospect and estimate from the DHS. And what are the lessons learned from the RAMS survey and the challenges? So it's really important to mention that the response rates are high in both arms. But what we can notice is that respondents are more confident when one uses phone numbers that were retried during a face-to-face survey compared to the random digit dialing. And so this can impact the data quality. And we were also surprised that language was not an issue in the survey. Before starting the survey, we were worried about the issue of language, since in Burkina Faso people speak a lot of languages. But what we found that is that with French and some key languages, it was possible to be without any problem. And in terms of challenges, it was difficult to reach women of reproductive age. Because first, the phone penetration rate is lower in women, and some women even asked the rights to the husband before responding to the questions. So it was difficult to reach women of reproductive age. And we also face some issues of network in some remote areas impacted by the conflict. So some network was destroyed by terrorist attacks. So if someone lives in this region, it can be difficult to reach him during a phone survey. And in terms of perspective, we have wrote a proposal on forced migration and health in the Sahel. So but in the first step, we want to focus on the case of Burkina Faso. And this project is not founded it's not founded yet, but the idea is to assess the causal effect of forced migration on child, women, and the overpopulation, health and well-being in Burkina Faso. And this is to analyze the causal effect of forced migration on child health and mortality. And so what was, as the speaker was saying, it can be difficult to differ, to make the difference between the direct effect of the conflict and the indirect effect of the conflict on mortality. And the second package is linked to the effect of forced migration on health in adult, health and mortality. And the final package will look at the contribution of forced migration to fertility transition in Burkina Faso. So in terms of design, we'll try to use the 2019 census and the internally displaced database to have a representative sample of the population, conduct a baseline face-to-face survey, and during this survey, we try to collect phone numbers of the resident and forced migrant and their relative, so that we can conduct follow-up mobile phone survey to assess the impact of the conflict on health and mortality. And we also intend to include some questions on violent death in order to have post-facing mortality. And as I was saying, the project is not found yet, and so we hope that in the near future we will be able to implement it to have an idea of the effect of the conflict on mortality. So it's what I had to share with you today. So I will welcome any comment or suggestion. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Bruno. And thank you, Casey, as well. Thank you both for your great presentations. Unfortunately, we've reached time, but I invite you to share and ask your questions to both presenters on the Measuring Adult Mortality Community of Practice web platform, where you can pose questions, where they'll be the presentations available as well. If you already are registered, you're welcome to check the platform and learn how to navigate it a bit better. If you're having difficulties, you can use this QR code. And if you're not part of this community of practice, you're welcome to join and register as well. Thank you both for really interesting presentations. And thank you. Thank you also to Rachel and Ramesh for their openings. Please continue to focus on adult mortality, and I hope we'll meet again in our next webinar.
Great, thanks very much. Really appreciate the opportunity to present. Thank you.
Thanks, Casey.
Thanks, Ashira.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you so much,
Thanks,
Ashira.
everybody. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci, au revoir.
Au revoir. Merci
Thank
beaucoup.
you.
Merci.
Thank you.